Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The sun of the alien world, known as Tare, burned fiercely overhead as Zelina trudged through the dusty market streets, her 3 children clinging to her, their faces gaunt and hungry. Her clothes, once vibrant and rich with the symbols of her noble lineage, were now faded and torn. The air smelled faintly of salt and ozone, and the heat caused the oppressive weight of her grief to grow heavier. Zelina had been a proud woman, a widow for several months, and though she had once ruled a household with power, her life now lay in ruins. Her husband, Raxer, had been a soldier, brave, strong, and a leader of his people. Yet in the chaos of the war between her people, the Takai, and the invading species from the planet Alier, Raxer had been lost. His body never recovered, and with his death came the fall of Zelina's fortune. Now she was forced to scavenge for food, for safety, and most of all, for the means to care for her children. The loss of her husband had stripped away her dignity, leaving her with only the desperation to survive. Yet today a strange opportunity beckoned. Rumors had spread throughout the markets of a man who had recently arrived in the city. It was said that this human, named Captain Elias Ward, had been a part of the peace negotiations between the various galactic factions. He was, in a word, powerful, and though humans were often seen as strange, primitive creatures by most of the galaxy's more advanced races, the Takai had recently begun to find them useful. Elias Ward was different from the others. He was strong, resourceful, and had the eyes of a leader. But what struck Zelina most was the unspoken reputation that humans had, of taking care of what they valued, of building families even in the most chaotic times. As she walked through the crowd, her heart quickened, her eyes scanning the foreign faces for one man in particular. She found him standing near a vendor selling exotic fabrics. Captain Ward towered over the other aliens, his broad shoulders and sturdy build setting him apart. His face was sun-kissed, a stark contrast to the pale complexions of the local populace. His dark brown eyes were focused on the fabrics, but Zelina could see the hardness in them, the kind of man who had seen too much and survived it all. Zelina took a deep breath and, with her children following closely behind her, she approached. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had nothing left to lose. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice tentative but filled with desperation. Captain Ward turned, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze searching her face. He saw the pain in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of a life too hard to bear. But it was her children that caught his attention. 3 small figures huddling together, clearly in need of protection. He knew what she was about to ask. "Yes," Ward replied, his voice deep, calm. But Zelina could hear the undercurrent of curiosity in his tone. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. What could she say? What words could convey the humiliation of a widow begging a stranger for help? What was left but to lay everything bare? I have nothing left, sir. My husband is dead. My family is starving. My children," she faltered, her voice breaking as she gestured toward the 3 small figures, their hollow eyes staring up at him. "Please, I beg of you, take me as your wife. I will serve you. I will do whatever it takes to help you." Ward took a step forward, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. There was a moment of silence as he assessed the situation, his mind working quickly. He had seen many things in his time: wars, devastation, people broken by loss. But this was different. The plea of a mother, the cry of a widow who would do anything to save her children, was a universal one, no matter the species. "I don't know what to say," Ward muttered, his brow furrowing in thought. Zelina, sensing her opportunity slipping away, took another step closer. "I know this is strange, but please, my people have nothing to offer. I have no dowry, no wealth, no title to offer you. But I have my loyalty, my strength. And my children, they need a father." Ward looked down at the 3 children, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The boy, a young one of no more than 6, clutched his mother's side with trembling hands. The 2 girls, older, perhaps 8 and 10, hung back a little, still clinging to each other. The sight tugged at him. He had come to Tare as part of a mission to aid the war-torn planet. But what was he really doing here? Helping with negotiations, delivering aid. But this was not something his mission had prepared him for. "You don't know what you're asking," Ward said, his tone soft but firm. "I know what I'm asking," Zelina replied, her voice full of quiet determination. "Please, I can't lose my children." For a long moment, Elias Ward stood silent, the weight of the world bearing down on him. The future of one widow and her children seemed a small thing compared to the larger forces at play on Tare. Yet something about her words struck a chord within him. He had seen broken people before, but never had he felt such a raw plea for help. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice less certain than before. Zelina, with tears welling up in her eyes, nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the noise of the market. Ward watched them walk away, his heart unsettled. What had he just promised? And what would come of it? The next few days were a blur for Zelina. She could barely remember how she made it through the market crowds or how she even managed to keep her children fed and sheltered. The weight of her desperate plea to Captain Elias Ward still echoed in her mind, replaying every word, every hesitation in his voice. He had promised to think about it, but she couldn't afford to wait. Each day brought the reality of their hunger closer, the desperate cries of her children growing louder in her ears. And as much as she hated to admit it, she needed a way out. As night fell on Tare, the city's streets grew darker, bathed in the glow of neon signs and distant starlight. The alien market had emptied out, and the quiet hum of the world's capital seemed more oppressive than ever. The towering buildings of steel and glass glimmered in the twilight, but to Zelina, they felt like cold, indifferent giants looming over her family. She had just finished preparing the last meal she could scrape together for her children when the door to their small, dilapidated apartment slid open. Zelina turned sharply, heart racing, but the sight of Elias Ward standing in the threshold froze her in place. He had come. For a moment, they only stared at each other. Ward's expression was unreadable, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. His shoulders were a little less tense, his eyes slightly softer than before. It was clear that he had been wrestling with something, and now he stood before her, a decision on the cusp of his lips. "I've thought about it," he said, his deep voice breaking the silence. Zelina's heart skipped. She stood from the small table, taking a cautious step toward him. "And," she whispered, not daring to hope. Ward's eyes flickered to the children, who sat silently by the corner of the room, looking up at him with curious eyes. He was a stranger to them, an unknown force, but they were smart enough to sense the gravity of the moment. Zelina felt a tightening in her chest as she watched her children. Could she really put their future in the hands of this man? A human, a species that had been at the periphery of her world for so long? "I can't say this will be easy," Ward continued, his voice steady. "But I've seen what you're going through, and I can't walk away from that. You and your children deserve more than what this place offers. More than just scraps of food and empty promises." Zelina's breath caught. Was this really happening? Ward stepped into the room fully now, his boots clicking against the floor. He looked around at the small, humble apartment, the thin bedding, the worn furniture, the simple kitchen that had been ravaged by time and neglect. His eyes lingered on the children again, their thin faces framed by the dim light. "I'm not going to promise you a fairy tale," he said after a long moment, his tone frank, "but I can offer you stability, safety, a way out of this." Zelina opened her mouth to speak, but her words faltered. She wasn't sure what he was offering, or how much she could trust him, but the desperation in his voice, there was something in it that seemed real. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. Ward paused, his gaze shifting toward the small table where a bowl of the meager meal sat untouched. "I don't want anything. Not at first." He hesitated again, as though unsure how to frame the next part. "But I'll need you to trust me, not just as a way out, but as a partner. I don't need a slave or a servant. I'm asking you to join me in this, whatever it ends up being." Zelina's chest tightened. The words hung in the air, too heavy for her to fully comprehend. She could hardly imagine what it would mean to trust a human in such a way. Her people, the Takai, had always been wary of other species, and humans were no exception. Their strange ways, their wild ambition, the unpredictability of their actions. It was hard to reconcile with her own expectations. But she had no other choice. "Partner," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I have nothing to offer you. No wealth, no power. Only my loyalty, my willingness to survive." Ward nodded slowly, as though weighing her words carefully. "Loyalty and willpower are more than most people can offer," he said. "And I'll be honest with you, this won't be easy. There will be people who will see us as weak. They'll try to exploit you, exploit me. But together we can fight back. Together we can protect your children." Zelina swallowed hard, looking over at her children, who were still sitting in their corner, eyes wide, unsure of what this new human figure meant for them. What future would they have in this world, with its endless political conflicts and wars? Her thoughts flickered back to Raxer, to the man she had loved, the father of her children. He had once been a strong warrior, a leader. She had been proud to walk beside him. But now she was a widow, alone in a world that didn't care. And yet, here was a man, a stranger, offering her a chance at something more. "How do I know you won't leave us when things get hard?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ward's eyes softened as he stepped closer. "Because I understand what it's like to lose everything. I won't leave you, not while I have the strength to fight. And as long as you're with me, I'll protect you." Zelina looked at him for a long time, searching his face for any hint of dishonesty. She saw nothing but resolve. And in that moment, something deep within her stirred. A flicker of hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. The choice was clear. There was no other path for her. No other way to ensure her children's future. She had already lost so much. This man, this human, offered her a chance to rebuild. "I accept," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than she could ever have imagined. Ward nodded. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. I have a place for you and the children. It's not much, but it's safe. And we'll figure out the rest as we go." As he turned to leave, Zelina felt a strange mix of relief and fear. She had made her choice, and the road ahead would not be easy. But perhaps, for the first time in months, there was hope on the horizon. The following morning, Zelina woke to the faint sound of chirping birds outside their small, run-down apartment. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting pale golden rays through the cracked windows. The cool breeze carried the scent of something unfamiliar, perhaps from the gardens of the highlands beyond the city, or from the distant shores of the planet's great oceans. It was a world she had grown accustomed to, yet today, everything felt different. As she rose from the thin bed, the reality of the decision she had made the night before began to settle in. Elias Ward, the human who had extended his hand to her and her children, had promised her safety, a way out. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had been able to offer them on her own. Her children, asleep in the corner, stirred as she moved around the room. Her son, the youngest, groggily blinked open his eyes and stretched, his small body still thin from malnutrition. The two girls, older and a little more aware, shifted under the covers, sensing the change in the air. "Mother," the oldest, Kayla, whispered, her voice quiet but curious. "Where are we going today?" Zelina turned to face her children, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We are going somewhere new, little one. Somewhere safe." "Safe?" Kayla asked, sitting up with a frown. "Like how father kept us safe?" The mention of Raxer's name struck Zelina like a physical blow. Her husband had been their protector, their pillar of strength. The grief was a constant companion, but she had learned to live with it, even if it meant carrying the weight of the loss every day. She knelt beside Kayla, placing a hand on her daughter's head. "Yes," Zelina said softly, "like your father did. But now it will be someone else's turn to protect us." The uncertainty in Kayla's eyes was clear, but she nodded, sensing that her mother wasn't the only one facing an unknown future. They had always been together, a family forged in the heat of survival. What would they become now? After a simple meal, mostly bread and a bit of fruit, the last of their meager stock, Zelina gathered her children, securing them in the few belongings they could carry. She kept the mood light, speaking of the new life that awaited them, even though part of her was unsure whether she believed the words herself. Soon, there was a knock at the door. Zelina's heart skipped, and she quickly moved to open it. Elias Ward stood there, his expression unreadable but his posture firm, as though he had made a decision long before he arrived. "Ready?" he asked, his voice calm. Yet there was an intensity in his eyes that Zelina couldn't ignore. "Ready," she answered, her voice steady despite the swirling emotions within her. She glanced down at her children and beckoned them toward the door. They followed her without question, their faces shadowed with fear but trusting her to lead them. Ward gestured for them to follow him, leading them down the narrow hallways of the building and out into the streets. Zelina couldn't help but notice how different everything felt now, how strange the world around her seemed as they left behind the squalid, overcrowded sector where she had once lived. The streets were quieter now, the air tinged with the faint hum of distant ships and vehicles hovering overhead. As they walked through the bustling market district, Zelina observed the way people moved, heads down, eyes avoiding each other, as though they were all pretending not to see the misery in plain sight. But with every step they took, she felt a strange sense of hope begin to form. She didn't know what this new chapter held, but for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that something better might be waiting for them. After what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at the outskirts of the city, where the towering buildings gave way to sprawling estates and lush gardens. Zelina's heart beat faster as she realized where they were heading. The place Ward had promised her. Was this really it? Before her stood a modest compound, surrounded by walls high enough to shield them from the outside world. A small garden bloomed with bright, unfamiliar flowers, and the house itself looked simple but sturdy. It was more than she had ever imagined for herself, but even more than that, it felt like a sanctuary. Ward turned to face her, noting the cautious look in her eyes. "This is where you and the children will stay. It's secure, and it's yours for as long as you need." Zelina stood frozen, unsure of how to react. The place seemed like a dream, but dreams had a way of fading when reality came crashing down. She had no wealth to offer, no power to wield in return. What could he possibly want in exchange for this kindness? "It's beautiful," Kayla whispered, her voice full of awe. Ward smiled softly, then turned to Zelina. "It's not much, but I promise you it's safe. I'll make sure you're protected. No one will harm you here." Zelina nodded slowly, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Could this truly be real? A new life, away from the poverty and despair that had consumed her for so long? It was hard to believe, but she had to. "What's next?" Zelina asked, her voice thick with the weight of uncertainty. Ward gave her a reassuring look. "Next you rest, get settled. But we'll need to start thinking about the future soon. There's more to this than just survival. There's rebuilding. For you and your children and for this planet. It's going to take time, but I believe we can do it together." Zelina glanced down at her children, who had already begun to explore the garden. Their laughter, faint but genuine, was a sound she hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity. For the first time in so long, she felt a flicker of something deep within her, something she thought had died with her husband. "Hope. Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of her gratitude. "For everything," Ward nodded, his eyes softening. "It's just the beginning, Zelina. We've got a long road ahead, but we'll walk it together." As they stood there, in the garden of their new home, Zelina allowed herself to imagine a future where her children would grow up in peace. A future where they wouldn't have to suffer as she had. It wasn't the life she had envisioned when she first married Raxer, but it was a life she could build. With Elias Ward by her side, perhaps they could rebuild not just her family, but something greater. Life in the compound was quiet, far too quiet compared to the chaos Zelina had grown used to. The first few days were filled with an almost surreal sense of normalcy, as if the harshness of her previous life had been some sort of nightmare. The walls around them kept the world at bay, and the small garden blossomed with unfamiliar flowers, their vibrant colors contrasting against the pale sky. The children, Kayla, Darren, and Saria, seemed to slowly adjust to their new environment, their laughter echoing in the garden as they played among the flowers. Zelina herself found herself lost in the strange rhythm of their new life. She had spent so many years in survival mode, running from one crisis to the next, that she now felt adrift in the calmness. But there was also a deep sense of gratitude. She had been given a chance that she hadn't dared dream of. She should have been grateful, but a gnawing discomfort lingered in the back of her mind. Elias Ward, her unexpected benefactor, was a constant presence in their lives, though he kept his distance. His role was clear. He was the protector, the provider, but also, at times, an enigma. He would check on them every morning, making sure the children were well, that they had enough food, and that their living conditions were secure. His presence was always there, but it was as though he were holding something back. He never spoke much about himself, never asked anything of her except for her trust. And that trust, Zelina realized, was the one thing she had not yet fully given. She had accepted his offer, yes. She had moved her children into this strange new life, away from the city's dirt and danger. But there were still pieces of her heart, buried beneath years of pain and grief, that hesitated. She had lost everything once before. Was she ready to risk that again? One afternoon, as Zelina sat in the small living room of the compound, stitching together torn clothing for her children, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't need to look up to know it was Ward. He had a particular way of walking, a steady, confident rhythm that was hard to ignore. "Zelina," he said, his voice carrying a note of urgency. She looked up, her needle frozen in midair. "Yes." Ward's eyes were more serious than she had ever seen them. His brow furrowed slightly, a sign that something was weighing on him. "There's something I need to talk to you about. Something important." Zelina set down the cloth and stood up, her heartbeat quickening. "What is it?" He motioned for her to follow him, leading her outside to the small courtyard that surrounded the compound. The air was cooler now, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the stone walls. "Something's happened," Ward continued, his tone grim. "There's a group of rebels operating in the city. They've been causing trouble, raiding supply lines, harassing the officials who've been trying to rebuild. They're getting more brazen, and it's only a matter of time before they turn their attention here." Zelina's stomach tightened at the mention of rebels. The war had left the planet divided, its people fractured between those loyal to the old ways and those who wanted to forge something new. Violence and unrest had become the new normal. She could see the flicker of worry in Ward's eyes as he spoke. He wasn't just worried for her. He was worried for everyone who had come under his protection. "What does this mean for us?" Zelina asked, her voice steady, though a knot of fear twisted in her gut. "It means we need to be prepared," Ward said, turning to look her directly in the eyes. "I don't want to put you or the children in danger, but I'm afraid this is only the beginning. They'll come looking for easy targets, anyone who's vulnerable. And right now, we're vulnerable." Zelina's heart pounded in her chest. She had known, deep down, that this peace would not last. Couldn't. She had seen it in the eyes of her people, the bitterness, the resentment, the hunger for power. The peace that had been negotiated between the galactic factions had always been fragile. War was a part of her world. She had lived through it, seen it tear apart everything she had ever known. But this time she wasn't facing it alone. Elias Ward was here, and he was offering her something she hadn't thought possible. The opportunity to stand and fight, rather than flee and hide. "What should we do?" she asked, her voice thick with a mixture of fear and resolve. Ward exhaled deeply. "I'll need your help. Not in the way you might think, but I need you to trust me. There are people in this city who want to destabilize everything we've worked for. And if they succeed, all the safety you've found here will be for nothing. But if we act quickly, we can stop them." Zelina's mind raced. She had never thought of herself as a fighter. She had been trained to lead, yes, but leading a family and leading an army were two very different things. Yet there was a fire in her chest, a flicker of something she had thought lost. The same strength she had once felt standing beside Raxer, fighting for her people. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice low but firm. Ward's eyes softened. "I'm not asking you to fight with weapons, Zelina, but your knowledge, your connections, your people. You can help us understand where these rebels are coming from, who they're working with. We can use that information to outsmart them before they make their move." Zelina's heart clenched as she realized what he was asking. It was not just a test of her loyalty. It was a test of her courage. Could she risk everything, including her children's safety, to help Ward defend this fragile peace? Could she face the remnants of her past, the ghosts of the war that had destroyed so much, and fight again? For a moment, she stood frozen, lost in thought. Then, as the wind rustled the trees in the garden, she made her decision. "I will help," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I will do whatever it takes." Ward's face broke into a small, approving smile. "Thank you, Zelina. You don't know what this means. For all of us." As they stood there in the courtyard, the sun finally dipping below the horizon, Zelina felt the weight of her decision settle in. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, and she had no illusion about what it would cost. But she would face it head-on, for her children, for her people, and for the fragile future they were building together. The days that followed were filled with a kind of quiet urgency. Zelina had always been a person of action, a survivor, but now she found herself in a position that demanded a different kind of strength. The rebel group Elias Ward spoke of was a growing threat, and their tactics were becoming more unpredictable. She knew they would not just strike at the heart of the city. Their reach would soon extend to every corner of the planet, threatening not only the fragile peace but also the future of her children and the people she had come to care for. Zelina had never been part of the political landscape of the Takai, and yet, the life she had led before her husband's death had given her knowledge of the undercurrents that swirled beneath the surface. It was this knowledge, combined with Elias's experience, that would hopefully turn the tide in their favor. The war had left scars on everyone. Alliances were fluid, and the line between friend and foe was often a blurry one. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Zelina met Elias in the small courtyard of the compound, her thoughts swirling. The children were inside, playing quietly, and she took the rare moment to focus on the task ahead. There was little time to waste, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. Ward had already been preparing the compound for potential attack, reinforcing the perimeter and securing the entrance points. Now it was her turn. "I've made contact with some old associates," Elias said, his voice low as he glanced around to ensure they were alone. "People who have ties to the rebel factions. They can give us the intel we need, but we'll need to act fast." Zelina nodded, her mind already working through the logistics. "And you want me to reach out to them?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. Elias hesitated for a moment, his eyes studying her. "Not exactly," he said. "I need you to be the one to meet with them." Zelina's brow furrowed. "Me? But you're the one they'll listen to," Elias interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "The rebels aren't going to trust a human. You have the history with them, the knowledge of their inner workings. You're the key to getting us what we need. I've already made the first contact, but now it's your turn to prove that we're serious, that we're not going to stand idly by while they tear everything apart." Zelina's pulse quickened as she realized the weight of what he was asking. She had lived through the war, seen firsthand the destruction it brought, and yet now she was being asked to work with the very forces that had caused so much suffering. These rebels, they weren't just people with a cause. They were the ones who had torn apart her world. They had been the ones who had slaughtered families, taken resources, and cast entire communities into ruin. She had seen what they were capable of. "How can you trust them?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "These are the same people who destroyed everything we fought for. You want me to meet with them, negotiate with them?" Elias's expression softened, but there was a hard edge to his voice. I don't trust them, Zelina. But right now, we don't have a choice. We need information, and the only way we're going to get it is by finding common ground, no matter how bitter it is. If we don't act, if we don't do something, the war will never end. We'll be stuck in this cycle forever. Zelina clenched her fists, her thoughts a whirlwind. Felt wrong. The idea of negotiating with the rebels, of making deals with those who had destroyed her life, made her stomach churn. But Elias was right. They had no time to waste. The rebellion wasn't just a political issue anymore. It was personal. If she could stop them before they reached this compound, before they took everything she had worked so hard to rebuild, she would. She had to. "Where do I meet them?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with reluctance. Elias's eyes searched hers, and for the first time since they had met, she saw a flicker of something deeper in his gaze. An understanding, a silent acknowledgement that this would not be easy for her. "There's a neutral zone outside the city. A place where we can speak without immediate danger. It's risky, but it's the best option." Zelina nodded, the weight of his words settling on her. "When?" "Tomorrow," Elias said, his voice firm. "We don't have the luxury of waiting any longer. You'll leave at dawn. Meet them at the old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It's isolated. If something goes wrong, we'll know. But this has to work." Zelina took a deep breath, pushing aside the fear gnawing at her. She had been through worse, hadn't she? She had survived the loss of her husband, the destruction of her home. She had faced the ravages of war. Meeting with the rebels was just another step in the survival game, another gamble, another risk. It was no longer a choice, but a necessity. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice resolute. "I'll meet them." The next morning, the compound was still. The only sounds the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of the city far beyond their walls. Elias had prepared her, armed her with what little information he had, and now, with her heart pounding in her chest, Zelina stepped into the shuttle that would take her to the neutral zone. As the shuttle lifted off the ground and the compound faded into the distance, Zelina couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. This was it. There was no turning back now. She had come to terms with the idea of fighting for her children's future, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about facing the demons of her past and learning to navigate a world that had lost its sense of order. The shuttle landed silently in the designated area, a clearing that was surrounded by the remnants of old buildings and rusting equipment. It looked like a graveyard for the failed hopes of the past, a place where broken things went to die. She stepped out of the shuttle, her breath catching in her throat as she surveyed the scene. And then, from the shadows they appeared. The rebels. They were a motley crew, haggard, dirty, their faces weathered by the harsh realities of war. But despite their ragged appearance, Zelina knew better than to underestimate them. These were not just simple fighters, they were survivors just like her. One of them, a tall figure with sharp features and dark, piercing eyes, stepped forward. He wore the mark of the rebel faction, an emblem of a shattered world. His gaze locked onto hers. "You're Zelina," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't think we'd see you again." Zelina met his gaze, unflinching. "Times change," she said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions inside her. "And people change. I'm here now. What do you want?" The rebel smiled, thin, dangerous. "You know what we want. But now, it's time to see if you're willing to take a side." Zelina's heart raced as the rebel leader stepped closer, his presence imposing. She was keenly aware of the weapons tucked under his jacket, the subtle shift in his posture as he sized her up. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied her face, as though weighing her very soul. He was no stranger to power, and he could sense the tension in her. But she stood her ground. "I didn't come here to negotiate for peace," Zelina said, her voice calm but laced with authority. "I came here to make sure my children and my people are safe. I'll make no deals with those who would destroy what little we've rebuilt." The rebel leader smirked, clearly amused by her defiance. "Safe? You think that peace is a gift you can simply hold in your hands? No one has peace in this world, not truly. Not after everything that's happened." Not after what they've done to us. Zelina's eyes narrowed. She understood the rebels' anger, their frustration. But she also understood the consequences of unchecked rage. The war had torn apart families, societies, and worlds. The cycles of violence had to end, but she feared that this path, the path of vengeance and chaos, was only going to lead to more destruction. "You think we're the ones to blame for all this?" Zelina said, her voice low and steady. "You think continuing the fight will bring you the peace you're after? No, it will only bring more death. More suffering." The leader's expression darkened. "We didn't start this war, Zelina. You of all people should understand that. We didn't destroy our world. It was the ones in power, the ones who sat comfortably in their palaces while the rest of us starved and bled." Zelina's pulse quickened at the mention of those in power. The same corrupt officials who had abandoned her people during the darkest days of the war. She knew the anger he spoke of was justified in some ways, but the price they were asking for was too high. "I'm not denying that your anger is justified," Zelina said, taking a slow breath. "But fighting fire with fire will only burn everything to the ground. If you want to truly rebuild, you have to be willing to find another way." The rebel leader scoffed. "Another way? And what would that be, Zelina? Surrender to the ones who betrayed us? Beg for their mercy?" She shook her head. "No. But you can fight to protect what's left, to rebuild. And that's where I come in. I'm not here to lead you in some futile battle. I'm here to help you understand that there's more at stake than just vengeance." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Zelina wondered if her words were falling on deaf ears. The rebel leader took a step back, studying her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. It was clear that he was considering her words, weighing them against the rage that had fueled his every action for so long. "Why should I trust you?" he finally asked, his voice quiet but dangerous. Zelina met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Because I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust the future. If you destroy what little peace we have, you destroy any chance of a better life for our children, for our people. I've lost too much already to let this war continue." There was another long pause, and this time it felt heavier, more pregnant with the possibility of change. The leader's eyes softened for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Zelina to sense that she might have made a crack in the wall of his fury. "How do you propose we stop this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with a reluctant curiosity. "You say we need to rebuild, but the ones in charge of this planet, those officials, are corrupt. We can't trust them." "I'm not asking you to trust them," Zelina said. "I'm asking you to work with the ones who want to bring change. I know where to find the resources that we need, the contacts who have influence. We can unite with the ones who want to rebuild, who want to protect the people instead of profit from the destruction." The rebel leader's eyes darkened again, though his expression was less hostile. "And what's your price, Zelina?" "There's always a price for such things. We don't do charity." Zelina hesitated. This was the part she had known would come, the part where the true cost of peace would be laid bare. She had no illusions about the consequences of negotiating with the rebels. But she had already made her decision. She would risk everything to stop the cycle of destruction, no matter the cost. "My price," she said slowly, "is simple. I want a future for my children, for our children, a future where they can grow up without fear, a future where they don't have to fight for scraps, where they don't have to live in the shadow of this war." The rebel leader studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. For the first time, Zelina saw something other than anger in his eyes. There was something more. Perhaps it was the flicker of recognition, or the faintest trace of hope. "Fine," he said finally, his voice resigned. "We'll consider your offer. But know this, if you betray us, if you're lying to us in any way, we'll make sure you regret it. And it won't just be you who pays the price." Zelina nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the stakes. She knew what was at risk. But the tension that had been gripping her since she first stepped into this meeting began to ease, ever so slightly. Perhaps she could find a way to steer this rebellion toward something constructive. Perhaps she could make them see the greater picture, a future that wasn't defined by bloodshed. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I won't betray you. But I can't do this alone. If we're to succeed, we need to work together. The road ahead will be difficult, but it's the only one we have." The leader gave her a single, curt nod, signaling the end of their meeting. Without another word, he turned and began to walk away, his followers trailing behind him. Zelina stood there for a moment longer, watching them disappear into the shadows, feeling the weight of the decision she had made settle around her. She had no illusions. The road ahead would be treacherous, and she would face many challenges along the way. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had made the first step toward peace. A peace that could protect her children and rebuild a broken world. The journey back to the compound felt different this time. Zelina's shuttle hummed softly as it ascended from the neutral zone and headed toward the shelter she had come to think of as home. She looked out over the sprawling landscape, her mind whirling with the implications of the meeting. The rebels hadn't made any promises, but they had listened, really listened. It was the first time in years that she felt like she might be able to influence the course of events, not just react to them. But the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her. Trust had been given, but it was fragile like glass. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything could shatter. Elias had been right. There was no room for hesitation now. As the shuttle neared the compound, Zelina steeled herself. She had no idea how Elias would react to the results of her meeting. She hadn't given him any specifics, only that the rebels were willing to consider her offer, though the path forward was still uncertain. She'd asked for a future for her children, for all children, one where violence didn't define their existence. But the price of that future was steep, and it wasn't just the rebels who had to make a choice. She, too, was committed to this cause now, and the risk was hers as much as anyone's. The shuttle touched down with a soft thud, the familiar compound coming into view. She gathered her thoughts and took a steadying breath before stepping out, her boots hitting the dirt with a quiet finality. As she walked toward the entrance, she was met by Elias, who had clearly been waiting for her. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his stance told her he was anxious for news. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice low, eyes scanning her face for any sign of what had transpired. Zelina paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. She wasn't sure how to tell him what had happened, or what would come next. She had asked for change, but in a way that meant they were all stepping into unknown territory. "They listened," she said finally, her voice steady but filled with complexity. "They're willing to work with us, but it won't be easy. The price will be high, higher than I thought." Elias raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Zelina looked up at the sky for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "The rebels want assurances, power, influence. They've fought too long for too little to simply walk away from the power they've built. But I told them we can offer something more, something that doesn't involve destruction. I told them we want a future, not just survival. I want to help them understand that their war needs to end." Elias's eyes softened slightly, but there was still a flicker of concern in his gaze. "And they believe you?" She nodded slowly. "They believe that I'm speaking from experience. They understand the loss, the pain, but I also made it clear that we can't keep fighting. We can't go on tearing each other apart." She paused. "But they won't trust us until they see action." Elias exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't like this, Zelina. I don't like how close you're getting to them. The rebels, these people, they're not just dangerous, they're unpredictable. We've been burned before, and the last thing I want is to see you and the kids caught in the crossfire again." Zelina stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. "I understand, Elias. I do. But I'm not doing this just for them. I'm doing it for us. For the future. I can't let this continue, this endless cycle of violence. If I can stop it, if we can stop it together, it will be worth it. For my children, for yours, for everyone." There was a long silence between them, a tension that crackled in the air. Then, finally, Elias nodded. "All right, if you're sure about this, then we'll move forward. But we'll do it on our terms. I won't let you walk into another trap. Zelina, you're right, peace can't be built on lies or manipulation. We need to show them that we're serious. Zelina's heart pounded in her chest. But there was something else there too. Relief. For the first time since she'd arrived on this world, she felt like she had someone who truly understood her struggle, who shared her vision for a better future. Elias had always been a man of action. But now, she could see the same hope beginning to flicker in his eyes, just as it had in hers. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trusting me, for believing in what we can do together." Elias gave her a small, tight smile. "Just promise me this, Zelina. If things get worse, if it looks like we can't protect ourselves, you get out. You take the kids and you get as far away as you can. I won't risk losing you or the children." She nodded, her gaze steady. "I promise." The weight of the conversation hung heavy between them. But there was something else now. Something stronger than the fear, the uncertainty. A shared resolve. They were facing an uncertain future, but they weren't facing it alone. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and tension. Elias and Zelina worked together to strengthen the compound, to fortify the defenses, to make sure they were ready for whatever came next. They began gathering resources, reaching out to contacts in the city who might be able to help them bridge the gap between the human and rebel factions. Every day, they took another step toward building the future they both longed for. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the first signs of peace emerged. The rebels, true to their word, sent envoys to meet with Elias and Zelina in the dead of night. They came not with weapons but with offers. Offers of alliance, of shared power. They weren't ready to lay down their arms entirely, but they were willing to listen. They were willing to negotiate. Zelina's words had made an impact. She had opened a door, and now, together, they could begin to walk through it. In the weeks that followed, both sides compromised. The rebels stopped their raids on civilian populations, and the remaining factions of the human government began to pull back their troops. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was progress. And for the first time in years, Zelina began to believe that the impossible might actually be possible. In the end, peace was never easy. It was never perfect, but it was a start. And as Zelina watched her children play in the garden one afternoon, laughing in the sun, she knew that this was the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.